Hi there, good morning. This is Stan Stahl of SecureTheVillage, and welcome to this month's webinar, Preparing for CMMC Certification. As we're starting, we're going to do something new this time. We're going to take a poll. So I'm going to launch a poll. It's got a few questions on it, and if you'd fill in just a little bit about yourself, why you're here. So the poll is now open. I am also, there we go. I think we're set on that. Poll is in progress. And while the poll is in progress, let me just say this this broadcast, Secure the Village, in fact, is sponsored by Miller Kaplan, CPA accounting firm here in Los Angeles. We're grateful to Miller Kaplan for being our sponsor, an investor in securing the village, if you will. So we're going to be talking about CMMC certification today. Let's see, I'm having some technical troubles right here, so forgive me. I hope everything's okay on what you're looking at. But our guest today is Chris Rose. Chris is a longtime friend of mine. We met several years ago. I gave a talk to a group of UCLA alums in the business school, and Chris was in the audience. He was at that point in the MBA program at UCLA Anderson, and we became friends. And Chris is the managing partner at a firm, Ariento, and he's also on the board of directors of Secure the Village. Chris, you want to say a few words?
Sure. Thanks, Stan. Yeah, as Stan said, we've been friends for a while, and he's kind of brought me under his wing, and he also serves on Ariento's board, advising us. What we do is we're a managed IT compliance and security service provider, and we heavily focus on the defense contracting space. We do some defense contracting ourselves. My personal background is military. I was in the Marine Corps as a communications officer, and ended up doing quite a few cybersecurity type operations overseas and here locally. And then when I got out, I worked for a company called MITRE. For those of you familiar with the defense contracting space, and Stan has worked for them as well. MITRE is a federally funded research and development center that helps the government in terms of skill sets that they don't have inherently, specifically cybersecurity. They're very well known for.
Yeah, as you say, very well known. I went to work for MITRE 1980. I mean, that's how long ago it was. It's hard to imagine 40 years ago, when the computer security industry was literally just getting started. The RAND Corporation had published their initially classified paper, and by the time I got to MITRE, it had been unclassified. But that was in the origins. That was really when we thought we could, through technology, build secure systems. Little did we know where this world was going to go over the next 40 years. So, Chris, really glad to have you here. Tell us a little bit about what you did. You were the CISO for the country of Georgia at one point. So that must have been kind of an interesting experience.
Kind of right place, right time. When I was, so I got sent over to, we were preparing the Georgian troops to go into Afghanistan, and we were doing some other different operations over there. This is the Republic of Georgia, borders Russia. So it's an interesting cyber region of the world. And I happened to be in the right place, right time, where when I was over there, the mission, we got to kind of bring in and establish a U.S. network outside of the embassy, including kind of a cleared network. So interesting times while over there for sure. I think that network's still up, but I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on. Let's we're going to be talking about CMMC and what all that means. So Chris, take us through the kind of the outline of what we're going to be talking about over the next hour.
Absolutely. So we'll start. It's not on this slide, but we'll start with kind of a quick background, because I realize that everybody on this webinar is not a defense contractor maybe hasn't heard of CMMC or doesn't know much. But then we'll jump into kind of where it's at. This thing is very much in progress. It has not been rolled out yet, so a status update. The coronavirus question that is coming across a lot is how is CMMC directly affected in terms of timeline and execution, and then we'll compare the past standard for government contractors and defense contractors to the new standard that's coming out, CMMC, and then we'll get into the meat, which I think Stan, we're well versed in what companies should be doing to prepare for this cyber standard and what it means for the future of cyber compliance.
Sure. Well, thorough thing. So, talk us through, like, how did we get here and where is this going and what do all these acronyms mean, et cetera, all of that stuff, Yeah.
Sure. So, I think it's important to kind of take a step back and look at the context. So in December 2017, the Department of Defense said that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, special publication 800-171, which is a cyber framework of sorts, but it's really 110 security controls with 14 security control families. They chose NIST, which had already been published, which was more geared towards small businesses. If you go back even a little bit further, there was NIST 853, which the Obama administration required for all defense acquisition projects. So when the Obama administration created a standard, NIST 853, this is a huge standard where a lot of the big defense contractors play in it, talking Booz Allen, Lockheed, Northrop, all of those. And this is actually what I did at MITRE in part, was they said, hey, if we're going to buy anything from you, any acquisition project, in order for, if it's a system or software, in order for it to be authorized to operate on the defense networks, we are going to evaluate it against this NIST 853 framework. And so that was the Obama administration. They realized that was, and they also said, hey, we recommend you, big companies, Lockheed, everybody that's a defense contractor, we recommend you abide by NIST 853 as well. And what turned out was that 853 is it's too burdensome for a small business. And so when they went back to the drawing board, they asked the NIST to come up with something that was a subset of NIST 853 that was more focused on small businesses. And this is, we're talking defense contractors, but this is National Institute of Standards and Technology. This was also recommended for all small businesses, and it's a framework that you can be evaluated against. And so that led to NIST 800-171, which is only about 110 security controls. And if you think about the old CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. Really, NIST 800-171 focuses on the confidentiality piece, whereas NIST 853 includes even more for confidentiality, but the integrity and availability piece, because they care about the whole picture. 800-171, more geared towards small businesses, is really about confidentiality of sensitive information. And specifically when it comes to the government, that is what they would call controlled unclassified information, or CUI. So that's part of the evolution. In December 2017, the Department of Defense said, we are going to require all defense contractors to be compliant with NIST 800-171, because they felt like that was a more realistic target, especially for the 71% of the defense industrial base that is 30 employees or less. So that was something that they felt that they could ask the small businesses to do. That was December 2017. Fast forward to 2018, and a pretty scathing Inspector General report came out about the defense industrial base and defense contractors, essentially saying that everybody was saying that there were NIST 800-171 compliant. They were actually checking a box or signing off on it when they got on a defense contract, but the inspection showed a very different story, and so that is what has led to the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, which was kind of conceived in early 2018 and kind of jumping into this slide and the specific status, has aggressively been created. So the model version 1 was released in January of this year, the end of January. That was the first model. So all of 2018, they did draft models. They took feedback from industry and different parties. In January of this year, they finally stamped Model 1. They said this will be the first iteration that the companies will be graded on for the new framework. They formed an accreditation body that will actually certify. So one of the big differences, we'll talk about some next slide, is with NIST 800-171, all a contractor had to do was self-attest. So they said, hey, I am NIST 800-171 compliant. They signed off on that when they were getting on a government contract, and that was passing. There were some inspections and audits depending on maybe the government agency that was the client, but not really. You could self-attest, and whether you were or weren't, it wasn't really inspected. Well, because of that scathing Inspector General report and CMMC, the biggest difference is that third-party auditors are going to be required to go in and actually certify a company and say you are certified for CMMC at a specific level, and therefore you can actually be on government contracts. The world of self-attestation is gone. So for that reason, there has to be an accrediting body. So the CMMC AB, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Accreditation Body, was formed in February of this year, and their mission, they're a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit in Maryland, kind of being built from the ground up, and their entire mission will be to train and certify the independent, what we call a C3PAO, certified third-party assessing organizations that will actually be able to go into the defense contractors and certify them at a certain level of CMMC. So that body was formed in February. They signed an MOU with the DoD at the end of March here, I think March 25th. So this is all very recent. Mm-hmm. They are focusing right now on a pilot group of the C3PAOs, certified third-party assessing organizations, to take them through training and get them to a point where they could go assess organizations, and then they'll continue on that pilot. They've said that by the end of April, they hope to have that first pilot group ready to go, and then what the Department of Defense has said, who's ultimately the customer here, is that by the end of this fiscal year, so the September 30th for the federal government, they're going to pick a subset of contracts. The number 10 has been thrown out, which they expect to be about 1,000 contractors. If you think about, some of these contracts are very large with a number of subcontractors, and that they'll show up in, whether it's a recompete contract that's coming back up for competition and bid, or if it's a new RFP, request for proposal, that's coming up in the fall.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, one of the questions we've already got on here is, as you look through the timing of this in particular, it's a very aggressive timing. I mean, with model version 1 coming out the end of January, and already version 1.02 coming out 7 weeks later, and looking to begin things end of April. Well, we're in the beginning of April already. One of the questions, and I think it comes into the next slide too, is the impact of COVID on all of this. But a lot of contracts are being pulled forward for early award. How's certification going to apply, do you think, to those companies that get these? So they're kind of out of sync with the certification process this way. Any sense of that yet, Chris?
I don't have an official answer. I mean, my guess, and based on everything that they're saying, is that those 10 contracts that they're going to pick for this year are probably going to be pretty kind of clean standard contracts that aren't going through something like an early award or getting pulled forward, just because they've committed, and they've said over and over again, and people have pushed back on this aggressive timeline. And I think, by now, I think people are starting to believe them, because they have really driven this thing through since it really kicked off in April, May of last year. But I think the expectation is that they will get it out this year, but they're going to consider things like that when they're picking the 10 contracts. I don't speak for the Department of Defense, but that's kind of my best guess on everything that we're seeing.
Yeah. Exactly, and that gets us right to the subject of, what's the impact of COVID-19 on this, and what can we see this slowing down as a result of COVID-19 and those kinds of questions.
And so you can see the two kind of quotes. The bottom one was by the PA officer for the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Sustainment and Acquisition, and then the other one by Katie Arrington, who she is kind of the I think her official title is CISO of the Sustainment and Acquisition Secretary of Defense. And so she's really the spearhead kind of behind this, out there communicating it for the Department of Defense. She's very much associated with it. So you can see their two quotes right there. Basically what they've said is this is not changing anything. This is now more than ever we need cybersecurity. You see a lot of the impacts. Going on with the COVID-19 attacks, and the volume of cyber attacks has even gone up. So they're even saying that this is even more justification for why we need to get this out and get this out yesterday. The only thing that's been said about a delay has really just been, hey, while they transition to remote in training this pilot group of auditors, that yes, that did delay them a little bit. Call it a couple weeks, but everything else remains on schedule, and you can see what they officially said right there.
Yeah, well, and I think the point you just made, that on the one level, because of COVID-19, things may slow down, just everything's slowing down. As Paul Krugman said, we put the whole economy in a coma. So we can survive this. And of course, the DoD, the Defense Department contracts are just a piece of that. The other side of it is the need has gone up because of COVID-19, just because we're seeing, with more work at home and everything else, we're seeing attacks rising across the entire economic base. And I would presume that this is also true in the in the Defense Department as well. I don't know if you've got any numbers on that at all.
I don't have numbers, but I do think I think it follows logic that who's going to be spending money in this time, right? It's the government, and if you look at CMMC itself, it is something that is basically creating an industry overnight of these auditors. I mean, you're talking. I think they estimate in 5 years there'll be about 75,000 auditors. 300 plus thousand defense contractors. So it stands to reason that with a potentially pending recession, the federal government's going to be the one spending money, and this would support the efforts of kind of continuing to create this industry and spur jobs.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so let's segue. That's kind of the context of CMMC. Let's now look down and begin to dive down into the details of what it is. And let's start with talk us through. On the one side, you've already mentioned NIST 800-171. We've done work in that space. I know Ariento as well does a lot of work in this space. And then the CMMC, and what's the same and what's different? Those kinds of things.
Sure. So I think the biggest one we already talked about, but it's important to say it again. The old model, NIST 800-171, or actually still the current model, is a self-attestation model. It's a raise your hand and say you've done it, but nobody is really inspecting it. We do have a few clients that their defense agency that was sponsoring them might have been a little bit more worried about cybersecurity, and they actually did do an audit, and we helped them through that audit. We provided kind of the necessary information, but the world of being able to say you're doing this and that's good enough, even under penalty of perjury, is gone. They will inspect this. They will verify. This is the trust but verify model, and it will be an independent auditor. So it's not something that whoever's maybe helped you with NIST 800-171 or who will help you with CMMC will be able to certify you. They've said, at least initially, that they're not going to pre-certify any solutions on the readiness side or on the managed services side. So it will require that independent auditor coming in. That's the big difference. The other piece that's important to that is with NIST 800-171, the deliverables that were required to be compliant, it was required that you did a readiness assessment against the 110 security controls. So whether you paid somebody externally, whether you did that internally, you had to go through and assess yourself against 110 security controls and come up with gaps that said, this is what we need to do in order to become compliant. Those gaps then just had to turn into what we call a POAM, so a plan of action and milestones, common terminology in the defense space. So the output for NIST 800-171 was a system security plan, which is just like policies and standards, standard kind of compliance documentation, and then this plan of action and milestones that you created from a readiness assessment that you either paid somebody to do to identify gaps or you did internally. That was good enough. So even for our clients that were audited by the Air Force or different government agencies, that's what they had to provide. They had to say, here's my system security plan, here's my plan of action and milestones. They didn't actually have to close the gaps. They just had to have a plan with deadlines on it to say that they were going to address it. That world is gone. So you still need a system security plan and a plan of action and milestones as part of CMMC. However, when this independent auditor comes in, you will certify where you're at. So if you have, and that brings up another important point, which is the second bullet, which is there's 5 levels to CMMC. So NIST 800-171 was all or nothing, right? So whether you were a landscaper and you were on defense contracts because you did landscaping on I live in San Clemente on Camp Pendleton right next door, or you were creating weapon systems or software, you all certified, it was a one-size-fits-all, everybody has to do 110 security controls, which doesn't make much sense, and they realize that. So what they've done now is they've come up with 5 levels. Level 1 being we'll talk about in a second, but the lowest level that only has 17 security controls, all the way up to level 5, which is going to be your more advanced clientele and contractors. And these levels they build on each other. So if you are level 5, then that means you have all the controls from level 4, 3, 2, 1. If you're level 3, you have all the controls from 3, 2, and 1. And so with this certification, when that independent auditor comes in, it's not just, you have to show them the SSP and the POAM, but they're going to certify you to where you're at. So if your contract comes up for recompete or you're going for a new contract and the part that you're bidding on says, hey, this requires a level 4, and you certified at a level 2 or a level 3, it doesn't matter. You can't go for that level 4. The DoD is not going to accept your bid. So you have to prove this certification. So that's a big difference in the sense that you will certify where you're at, and so you better actually get the POAM and start doing it, because it's not good enough just to say, well, here's our plan to do it anymore. So jumping back into the slide, so you have the self-attestation plus now the independent third-party audit, the 5 levels so that you can start to differentiate, and these levels will be specified, and contracts, especially the big ones, will have different levels within them. So it's not like a contract's going to be like everybody has to be level 3 to do this. Let's take China Lake for example, right? The rebuilding project that's going on up there because of the earthquake. That's something that some of those contracts will have multiple levels. We get back to the landscaper example. They might be at a level 1 if you're bidding on the landscaping stuff. But if you are bidding on rewiring the base or the new buildings and installing networking, cybersecurity, and firewalls, you're probably going to be at a level 3 or above. So that's a good example. The other thing is that there's more. In NIST, they call them security controls. There were 110 of them total. Now they've turned it into processes and practices. And we'll talk about this in a second. But processes, think more documentation. Well, you have to document both actually, but processes, think more kind of SOPs, and then practices is really the implementation of technology. But they've added, there's what is that, 61 more now across the whole 5 levels. If you take a look specifically at level 3, so what they didn't want to do is they didn't want to make all of the NIST stuff irrelevant. So they looked at all the other standards out there and they incorporated them into this, and they've already done the mapping for NIST 800-171, which is what every defense contractor should already be doing. That maps pretty much directly to a CMMC level 3, plus an additional 20 controls. So it's important to know if you're really good on NIST 800-171, good for you. You don't have as much work to do. But if you're going for a level 3, that's only 110 of the 130 security controls. They have added additional controls. So that's another difference between NIST. They added some domains. If you go back to what I was talking about with NIST 853 being really big and 800-171 being less and being really just focused on the sensitive data and controlling that, I think what they realized is, hey, they want to expand this a little bit more than just that confidentiality piece, although that is still the focus. And so they did pull some of the domains from 853 that weren't in 800-171. And finally, the last 2 bullets, which are important, is 1, this will be an allowable cost. So ultimately, the Department of Defense expects to pay the bill. It'll be something that is that you can put in your rate cards, and they expect the bills to go up because you're having to achieve this certification now. And the other thing is that there's 2 keyword pieces of information that you need to understand that this really has to do with, and that is FCI, or federal contract information. And that is something that was not really a part of NIST 800-171. It's always been in the DFARS, which is the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, kind of the guidelines for the defense acquiring products and services. They've always said that federal contract information, which is information that as a contractor, as somebody that's bidding, you might attain that is not public information, but that the department wouldn't want kind of getting out there. That is now actually included in CMMC as opposed to just it's still in the DFARS. But so that's one type of information that's protected here. The other is the one that was also in this 800-171, which was the CUI, the controlled unclassified information. And so you've had them pull FCI into the actual model as opposed to just being in the DFARS.
Yeah. So a couple of questions have come in as we've been talking about this. So before we move on to the processes and practices and that piece of it, first of all, you're a defense contractor. How do you know what level you're going to be required to perform at? Is that clear?
It is not. And we get that question all the time. So, I mean, it will be ultimately in the RFIs and the RFPs. The kind of the guidance given is if you're a sub and you work with bigger primes, that's something to start having conversations with them because they tend to be more informed early on some of this stuff if they're the prime on a big contract as far as what it looks like. The recommendation that's out there is so if you have controlled unclassified information, if you've ever touched it, if the Department of Defense has ever given it to you, if there's a chance, you need to be at least a level 3. That's where CUI starts. So that would be the recommendation is, and these all they build on each other. So it's easier to get from level 3 to level 4 than it is to go from 1 to 4. But the only kind of guidance that's really been put out there is, hey, if it's going to be CUI, you got to start at a level 3, and that's where you should start. If you're not handling CUI and there's not really any chance of that in a contract that you're on or that you want to go after, now you're talking about a level 1 and 2. And we'll talk in a second, but level 2 is really just a transitional level in kind of how they designed it.
Yeah, good on that. The other question that I see already coming in is we're living inside the federal space of, you know, the NIST cyber framework, NIST 800-171, NIST 853, now CMMC. How does all this play out with ISO 27001?
So I think TBD. ISO, and you look at the manufacturing and the quality control side of the defense industrial base, right? And ISO and AS 9000 is a part of that, 9001. So there's definitely overlap. We expect there to be mappings, but at the end of the day, I mean, my personal opinion is at some point one of these cyber standards frameworks has to kind of start winning out, and pick which one you want to bet on. If you talk to the people that love CMMC, they say this is going to be the one to supersede all of them, and they're all going to nest and fall under it. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but the answer to that question is I don't think we know exactly. I do think there's going to be mappings for sure, but bottom line, if you are going to do business with the Department of Defense, and there's close eyes on this from the rest of the government, so eventually this could become a thing for that, then they are going to grade you on CMMC. The other important thing of note is there has been talk about reciprocity between other standards potentially after these mappings get kind of completely done. What that will look like, we don't know, but there is the possibility where the Department of Defense says, okay, if you're ISO certified, that accounts for 60% of your level 3. We'll take that, and then you just have to do this additional 40 or whatever that looks like.
Yeah, be interesting when we see these mappings, because the ones I look at so far, there's a lot of play in how they connect together and all. So I guess that's a stay tuned kind of
Exactly.
thing. Yeah. If we move on to our next slide. Oops, sorry, I went too far that time. Just looking at it, and one of the things that I find interesting about the levels here is that there's processes and practices. It's not just the processes. And talk us through what the intent of this slide is.
Sure. So as I mentioned, that when you think practices, think implementation of technology, and when you think processes, think kind of your SOPs and certain things. All of them have to be documented. Both of them have to be documented. So whereas other compliance standards that we've seen sometimes don't require you to get as much into detail about documenting the implementation of the technology and maybe the settings and what you're doing there. That expectation with CMMC is absolutely. So this is not, this is a deeper level of documentation that is going to be required. But if you look at these levels, and then the other thing that's important, that the title of this slide is what's written into CMMC, and they keep drilling this in, which is, hey, when that auditor shows up, they are going to be looking for the demonstration of the institutionalization of processes and the implementation of practices. And so I think what they're trying to say there is the implementation of practices tends to be pretty easy to evaluate, right? You can run scans, you can look at configuration settings, you can run SCAP scans and compare it against the Defense Information Systems Agency Secure Technical Implementation Guides, right? You can tell if people are they purchasing the right technology, are they implementing it correctly, are they configuring it correctly. That tends to be a little bit more black and white than the institutionalization of processes. And what we think they're trying to say there is really that, hey, in the past and with a lot of compliance standards, people would go out and they buy their template forms, or they create them and they just say, boom, we've got the processes, here they are. Mm-hmm. Well, what we think they're saying here is they're actually going to put that to the test. So it's one thing that's great that you have that nice documentation on what you do when a user leaves the company and or an employee leaves the company and following a checklist or whatever, but they're actually going to figure out, are you doing it, or training, mm-hmm. for example, right? It's great that you have these training, you say you do training and you have some records of training. Well, we're going to actually test some of the people who are in your security, whether they're outsourced or insourced. Are they actually following these processes that you have written down? Do they even know about them? Have they been trained on them? So mm-hmm. I think that's a key piece, that institutionalization you're gonna have to demonstrate. But back to the levels, I mentioned level 3 is where controlled unclassified information starts. And so that is that, and that's pretty much a direct mapping to NIST 800-171. So that's kind of the current standard. Level 1 is strictly to do with federal contract information. So this is not anybody that processes controlled and classified information. And there you actually do not have to have any documentation if you look at the processes. You just have to perform them. So no documentation required at level 1. Level 2 appears to be kind of the way it's being interpreted is really it's a transition step to those that are going to enter the world of CUI or might want to, because it really just seems like it's designed more to be an intermediate step. Essentially, you're either processing FCI or CUI. That in-between stage is really like a transition phase, and that's where you start to have actual documentation. And when we say documentation, we mean a policy for every domain. We mean documentation of the practices and the technology and how it's implemented. When you go up to level 3, that's where it needs to be managed. And they specify that what managed means is you're actually, you're not just that you're maybe reporting on it, but you have a plan to resource it. So if you think about, it's great to buy all this technology and implement it, but do you have the people involved to actually run it and resource it and maintain it? So they actually specify, talking about resourcing, and now you're getting up into the budgeting and line items and whatnot. Reviewed is okay. You're doing regular evaluations of the documentation and these processes and practices and reporting and audits, and is this working? And then kind of the typical level 5 of any maturity model is more the optimization, where you have more of an advanced progressive security posture. I think another thing that's important, if I were to give my quick summary based on our deep dive into CMMC, is level 1 is kind of your basics. Level 3 is where you start to get into your ability to identify and recover from a breach, or at least investigate a breach, I would say. So that's where you start to talk about centralized logging and gathering all logs. But it's not necessarily like a real-time SOC where somebody's evaluating these in real time. It's maybe a periodically, if you're small enough, going and looking at it, but you're collecting the data. You're doing all the right cyber hygiene type things. Level 4 and 5 is when you start to get into the security operations centers and actually having monitored security by people that know what they're doing in a real-time level.
Yeah, that's very similar. I mean, it's all these capability maturity models kind of flow back to the original software engineering one in the late 80s. I was involved as a user after those were developed, and that whole idea that when you get to manage, reviewed, and optimizing, you're now centrally managing. Now you're collecting metrics. Now you're using those metrics to optimize your performance. That whole structure seems to be built into this, which is a good natural way, if you will, from my perspective at least, of looking at this. Let's go on and talk somewhat about the costs. These are obviously estimates for smaller companies, but talk us through this. There's a lot on this slide, and also in terms of one of the questions that comes up, what in here are allowable costs as well, as you take us through this?
Sure. So the answer is the whole thing is technically allowable, right? You're going to put in your rate card what it's costing you to achieve CMMC, which includes both the readiness, whether you're having somebody come in to assess you and identify the gaps, or you're doing that internally, the technology that goes into it, the resources, the labor to implement it and carry it through, as well as the audit. So from an allowable cost standpoint, it's all allowed. And I could say that one of the things that pissed the Department of Defense off is that people were claiming in their rate cards a certain number already for NIST 800-171, and then that Inspector General report came out and they said, okay, well, if you're going to claim this and we're paying the bill for it and you're not even doing it, well, then we're gonna inspect it. But kind of back to this slide. So this is an estimate based on our team's kind of initial deep dive into CMMC as to what we think as far as if you were starting from scratch. So if you were maybe a brand new company, with kind of a clean slate, what it would take to go level to level. So the way to read this would be at level 1, which again is just dealing with federal contract information. The level of effort required to implement those 17 security controls is what we would consider low. So we're defining that as under 40 hours. To maintain it is also low. A part-time employee could or outsourced person could maintain that. And then the cost would be cheap, under $500 per user per year. And when we say user, we typically mean technology user, computer user. And then the skill set required would be one that hey, a general skill set, that could be a general skill set to implement that. You don't necessarily need a specialist. Whereas if you kind of, and this is stepwise, if you start to get up towards level 3 and level 4, you start to require more specialized skill sets, whether it be a security engineer, a network engineer that's really strong in boundary protection and firewalls, and all the way to experts, especially at level 4 and 5, where this is not just something that any general IT person can pick up and do. So that's kind of how you read it. This is stepwise. It builds on each other. And then you can see at the bottom there the different controls. As well, you can see what I talked about before, where we start with FCI. Level 2 becomes kind of a transition step to, hey, we're going to start dealing with CUI. Level 3 is where CUI starts, and you can see kind of the goals of that.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So let's move on now from kind of, we just took a deep dive into the space of CMMC, all the levels and so on. Let's look at the next slide, which begins to put how do we methodically, from that place of very little security, build ourselves up to CMMC level 3? And this is a slide you and I put together for a talk we had done earlier, and will in fact be doing again with the Aerospace and Defense Forum. Good call out to them. They've been friends of ours on working on helping to educate the community on CMMC. But we talked about there being foundational practices that flows into NIST 800-171. That flows, as you talked about, into level 3 as one goes further. And if you look at the foundational practices, underlying all of this, it seems, Chris, is the NIST cybersecurity framework. This is, I think, a major achievement 4 or 5 years ago, and now with the cybersecurity framework version 1.1, even more. But this is that whole basic idea that whatever you're doing, you got 5 fundamental things to pay attention to. Identification, protection, detection, response, and recover. Those 5, and in there are these 19, I think 6, 5, 4, yeah, something like that sub elements, if you will. There, these all now flow into first NIST 800-171 and then into the CMMC, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, they didn't. I think they've been getting criticized for reinventing the wheel, but they've said specifically that they heavily leaned on NIST and some other frameworks to not make this a reinvention of the wheel. They just needed it to fit their current needs. And they've even said that NIST will be involved in the certification of the auditors and kind of the standard that's used potentially for the third-party assessing organizations.
Yeah.
But I totally agree.
And then the same thing with outside of the federal government, but there's the Center for Internet Security. There are 20 foundational controls listed here. This is version 7 of the CIS controls. These have been demonstrated just empirically to, as you implement these controls, even just the basic ones, you particularly lower the likelihood that you will suffer an attack and be compromised as a result of the attack. So I think that when we look at the base to CMMC to NIST, thinking in terms, first of all, of the cybersecurity framework and the CIS controls certainly leaves, here's a base, here's another way to slice and dice this stuff, if you will, so as to see your way through, see your way clear to implementing NIST 800-171. Is that an accurate statement?
I think it's spot on. And if you actually look at CMMC and all the controls and and the references that they put as they came up with each control, there's really three main references that show up over and over again: NIST 800-171, the CIS controls, and then the other one is the CERT RMM, which is a different thing. But you're spot on, Sam.
Mm-hmm. And then looping back to Secure the Village and what we've done, we took the framework and we took the Center for Internet Security 20 controls and looked at the question of given, and now we're switching subjects from CMMC and the Defense Department to California's CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which talks about a need for reasonable security practices. And so we asked ourselves the question, you're being on our board, you were a part of all of that. What's reasonable? What do you have to have, which if you don't have, you're not reasonable? And we identified these 9 elements: security management, subject matter expertise, security management of information, securing the human, securing the IT interface, access controls, and so on, security management of the IT infrastructure, third-party assurance, resilience, and governance, ultimately. This also, it would seem, then would play very much into get these things under control, if you will, as part of CMMC. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it all ties together, and if you've done any of these things, it's not a waste. It's just a matter of mapping it or putting it in the format that is CMMC if you're a defense contractor.
Yeah. And then one of the questions that surfaced, having just used the word reasonable when it comes to these practices, we built them in that context. Is there a sense of reasonableness to CMMC and others, in the sense that, okay, what's reasonable for Lockheed and what's reasonable for a third-tier Lockheed subcontractor are, in some sense, very different? Does the audit practice, the CMMC auditing and all, look like it's going to take that into account?
I think it's going to have to. I'll tell you that the standard itself was created by John Hopkins and Carnegie Mellon, like the Software Engineering Institute. They were the ones that created the standard, and I from what I understand, they very much they definitely, we participated in some of the industry feedback. They definitely did a great job of kind of putting out drafts and soliciting industry feedback. And also at the same time, using either themselves or maybe some pilot companies to say, well, what, are we making this too burdensome? What does this mean for, could we even achieve level 4, level 3, wherever we think we would be? So I think there will be reasonableness in it. It's all still yet to be seen. But I think that one of the ways they tried to address this is really with the levels. Because NIST 800-171 was a one-size-fits-all, they got the feedback that just, it's not realistic, and so they've kind of taken that as the middle level, and they've said, okay, well, there's certain companies that or organizations that require less, and then there are some that like maybe the Lockheed that require more advanced security.
Yeah, and to me that's reasonable. Just looking at this as a citizen who has spent some time in this space, a small contractor with really sensitive information is going to have to be held to a higher standard even than, let's say, a large contractor who may have controlled unclassified information, but it's unclassified. So a level 3 may be sufficient for them, whereas a smaller organization may be involved in something like what it took to get bin Laden, go back several years. By God, they got to be level 5. You got to be really careful about what information an organization like that might have or might be responsible for.
And I think the other thing that's important to note here is the government's ultimately paying the bill, and you're going to have to be certified before you can bid on the contract. So the idea that there's not going to be the other contractors out there that are going to be able to undercut you just because they're not doing something that's a requirement, because they're not going to have the certification. So if the burden goes up, right, because you're required at a certain level, well, the cost is going to go up, and ultimately the one paying that bill is the government. Now, I understand the whole gap, and what if you don't get the contract and you've done this? I think they're still trying to kind of work through some of that, but at the end of the day, the government is paying the bill for this.
Yeah. Good. Well said. This next slide, I just want to take a moment on it. The reality is, and even with the poem, we're okay. What's the gap? How do we close the gap? That speaks to an iterative approach to improvement and continuous improvement. And this is something that actually goes back to my aerospace days when I worked at a company, TRW, no longer around, and I had the good fortune of working with Barry Boehm, who is the father of software engineering, and cost controls and understanding the economics of that. And Barry put a spiral model together, and this modifies that a bit. But the whole idea is you're moving forward on this is do an assessment, find out where your gaps are, decide what your next generation improvements are going to be, plan for that. Failing to plan is planning to fail. Then implement it, and then step back again. Okay, what do we do? How do we do? Do another assessment, and keep that process going as an ongoing evolutionary way. Even as you're on your way to CMMC 3, but let's acknowledge that in 2 or 3 or 4 years, as the threat profiles increase and so on, what's required for CMMC 3 could itself go up. So want to offer this as a mechanism, a model, if you will, for continuous improvement. In the interest of time, though, I do want to move on to the next slide. Can CMMC become a single standard? And this speaks to both some of the questions we've been receiving and also what you alluded to earlier. So let's spend a moment or two on this, and then we'll kind of wrap it up and take it on home, if you will.
Absolutely. I think so. This is starting with the DoD. The DoD tends to be a place where when things start and have proven that they kind of spread to the rest of the federal government and maybe even down to kind of the sleds, the state, local stuff. What you could kind of glean from what they're saying is so the federal government has close eyes on this. The other agencies that are non-defense, they're on the board, they're watching this stuff. They've been involved in kind of the creation, so they're keeping a close eye. I think it's reasonable to expect, and it's even been said that if this proves successful from a defense standpoint, it's more than likely that this would be kind of, and this will be an evolving standard, but at some point it'll be adopted across the federal government at least. Whether the states and local governments look at it and start to say, hey, this is something that we need to do, and they actually have the money to pay the bills, I don't know. But the true CMMC enthusiasts will tell you that this is the future standard, and this is going to make it even all the way to commercial, because this is the way that we should be. This is just what we need to do from a cyber standpoint, is evaluate and certify companies on maturity. I'm not sure my personal opinion if I buy that it could all make it all that way. But I do think that it is reasonable to, if I were betting that if this thing does all right for the DoD, that the rest of the federal government will adopt it and require it.
Yeah. I mean that would seem to be the way this is phasing in. It looks to me that we'll see this more. I don't know how it fits. Sorry about that. Moving back, I don't see how it fits into the commercial realm yet. I think there'd be a lot of pushback on what that looks like. But this is one of those stay tunes. We're going to find out over the next 2 or 3 years, I would think.
And the other thing I would say is I agree with you. There's a precedent for this, right? The UK has done something kind of like this. It's not quite as robust. Australia, the same thing. So, and those were used as inputs again for the development of CMMC. So there's also international eyes on this, not just because they do business with the Department of Defense, but there is a chance that this becomes an international standard, or there's something similar where there's reciprocity.
Sure. So as I said, we're coming up close to the top of the hour. So let me move on real quickly. Here's a whole set of resources that Chris, you've put together for us. Thank you so much for this. And if you can't write all this down right now, don't worry. We'll publish this, we'll publish the webinar, we'll publish the PowerPoint on the Secure the Village website. That should be up by early next week. So you can get all of these references again. The CMMC Marketplace, that's something you guys are doing. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, I'm on the board of it's a nonprofit that's putting that out there. But yeah, if you're familiar with the government stuff, marketplace is a familiar term, FedRep marketplace, things like that. But the idea is a place where you could go to find the certified vendors or service providers, or also kind of products and services as you need to address your compliance and your gaps, vetted products and services.
Okay. Also, for those who, we're not going to spend any time on it now, but there's a couple of pages of appendices where the domains and capabilities are listed. Again, those will be up online next week. There's 17 domains and the 43 capabilities across 2 slides. So those will be online next week. But that basically wraps it up for today. We didn't get to all the questions, but in those references, I think you can find answers to the questions you've got, and I'll have Chris's contact information show up on the screen momentarily. So certainly, I guess, Chris, reach out to you on this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dan, I appreciate the time as always. I know we've had a number of conversations offline just like this, so hopefully it was valuable.
Yeah, cool, good. So with that, let me just give a preview for next month. We're going to start a 2-part series. We're going to do May and July. It looks like are going to be the 2 webinars. We're going to be going from real, corporate, high-tech, government, Defense Department, place to another extreme, if you will, which is what about the home and family? One of our board members, Steve Krantz, has just come out with a book. It's available on Amazon called Cyber Guardian, a Secure the Village guide for residents. And so we're going to spend a couple of months working with Steve to go through all the things that people as individuals, as families, need to be thinking about, and not just on the, okay, what about your computer, but things like freezing your credit as well. So we'll be talking about that. If this is your first Secure the Village event, hopefully it won't be your last. We'd like to invite you to get involved, join the Village. You can follow us on LinkedIn. We publish a free cybersecurity news of the week with a weekend vulnerability and patch report that comes out every Sunday. Please sign up for that on our website. We've got a lot of virtual events that we're beginning to plan, all geared around conversations in cybersecurity, very much like what this was, Chris and I having a conversation in some sense about CMMC, and we're going to broaden these out more than just webinars. We're looking at town halls and also happy hours, which will be time to build community inside of the building the community in cybersecurity. If you're active in cybersecurity, think about joining our leadership council. You can find out more information on that on our website, and think about co-hosting a virtual event. Send us an email, put co-host event in the subject line, and we'll get back to you and put something together for that. In terms of following up, you can reach out to me at stan@securethevillage.org. There's my phone number, or chris@ariento.com. And Chris's phone number as well. Please reach out to us. I mean, it's as we say regularly, and we've been saying it for a long time, it takes the village to secure the village. So please be part of our village and reach out to us and as I say, be a part of us. Chris, any final words, final thoughts before we close it down?
No, I appreciate the time, and do it again a couple weeks.
Yep, look forward to it. Always with you, Chris. Thank you so much, and really great. And thanks everybody for being a part of this. I hope we've provided value to you. You'll get a survey in the email coming up soon. Please respond to that. And with it, let's end the webinar, and we are adjourned. Thanks again, Chris, and thanks again to everybody who joined us.